Blog Talk Radio. Hello and welcome to Subversive Radio. I'm your host, Keith Giles, and we have a great podcast for you this evening. We're going to finish up. This will be part 2 of What's So Great About Constantine. I am joined by my friend and my guest, Dr. Al Baker, and we're going to finish up what we didn't get around to in part 1 of this podcast. We kind of got really kind of deep in the weeds a little bit with some introductory things and setting some things up, but we really wanted to focus on a few specific things in this evening's podcast. And Al and I have actually enjoyed getting to know each other and talk to each other on these podcasts so much that we want to do in a series of them. So we were, even before the music started, Al and I were discussing about the possibility of doing some future podcasts as well on things like Christian pacifism and nonviolence in the early church, and as well as things like hierarchy in the early church and just when that began. So look forward to that coming up. Anyway, I want to welcome to the program my friend, Dr. Al Baker. Welcome.
Hey, Keith. Good to be here again. I enjoyed our conversation last week and had a lot of good emails come to me from visitors off our website listening to the podcast. So, yeah, and I look forward to our conversation tonight.
Yeah, well, I do too. I'm looking forward to it very much. So I'm going to kind of just jump right into it here. What we want to focus on, at least at the beginning here of the podcast, is really get into the idea of Constantine's faith. And specifically whether or not Constantine was a Christian, a follower of Christ, or not. And so we're going to kind of just begin. I'm going to begin by reading an account of his conversion experience. This was reported by Eusebius, and this is an account of a dream that Constantine had the night before the battle, a great battle, the Battle of Milvian Bridge. So it was a pivotal battle, and the night before that, this is according to Eusebius, I'm going to be reading now from Eusebius. He says, Constantine prayed to God. He asked him and besought him to say who he was and to stretch forth a hand to him in his present situation. As he prayed in this fashion, and as he earnestly gave voice to his entreaties, a most marvelous sign appeared to the emperor from God. It would have been hard to believe if anyone else had spoken of it, but a long time later, the triumphant emperor himself described it to the writer of this work. This was when I had the honor of knowing him and of being in his company. When he told me the story, he swore to its truth, and who could refuse to believe it, especially when later evidence showed it to have been genuine? He says, around noontime, when the day was already beginning to decline, he saw before him in the sky the sign of a cross of light. He said it was above the sun, and it bore the inscription, Conquer with this. This vision astounded him, and it astounded the whole army which was with him on this expedition, and which also beheld this miraculous event. He said he became disturbed. What could the vision mean? He continued to ponder and to give great thought to the question, and night came on him suddenly. When he was asleep, the Christ of God appeared to him, and he brought with him the sign which had appeared in the sky. He ordered Constantine to make a replica of this sign, which he had witnessed in the sky, and he was to use it as a protection during his encounters with the enemy. In the morning, he told his friends of this extraordinary occurrence. Then he summoned those who worked with gold or precious stones, and he sat among them and described the appearance of the sign. He told them to represent it in gold and precious stones. At the time I have been describing, he resolved to worship none but the God who had been revealed to him. And so that is Eusebius's account as told to him by Constantine of his conversion experience. So a couple of things that I want to note about this conversion experience. One is, and Al, jump in here if you have anything to add to this part of it, because when I was looking at this, I also saw a few other sources, and so there was a little bit of I think, just to real quickly say, most scholars agree with this version, with Eusebius's version, but there are other versions that some other scholars look to that say that it was a vision. Eusebius seems to suggest it was a dream, meaning he was asleep, and he God spoke to him in a dream. Yet even Eusebius's account, it starts off saying it's a dream, but then it says that he sees something in the sky, and the soldiers with him, the army with him, also saw it. And then it says he fell asleep, but if he was already asleep, it would be weird that he would fall asleep again. So there's sort of a question there of like, well, was it a dream? Was it a vision? Was it a dream? And then later, was it a vision? So that part of it is still, I think, a little unclear. I don't know. What do you think about that aspect of it, Al?
The way I read it, he is preparing his troops for battle the next day. He's camped on the other side of the river, and he goes out in the middle of the day and he sees this thing in the sky. A vision is how he describes it. And then that night, while he's sleeping, he has a dream. And so the dream is to help him understand what he had seen the day before. It's important to know that he had Christian clergy traveling with him already before this even happened. And he actually asked them what in the world he had seen. And they were the ones who once he described it, they were the ones who said, "Oh, that's a cross. You know, that's what, Jesus was crucified on, or whatever." So we don't get that kind of detail. We only have a couple of accounts, like you said, and Eusebius is the one that most people look to. But you remember that Eusebius says that he communicated and marveled to his friends, calling them together, showing, they sat in the midst, and he was trying to show them what he had seen using, rocks and stones. But the point being that I can't remember which other account it is. I can't remember if it's Lactantius. I can't remember if it's Socrates, of the later church historian. But the other part of the account is that he had Christian clergy traveling with him, and he had asked them for explanation of what he had seen. So the way I see it, he had a vision in the sky, and then that night he's given a dream to explain what he had seen.
Right. Okay. And that's fine. And I don't want to get around. I don't want to spend too much time just on the T's and C's and P's and Q's of the actual account of the vision itself. That may or may not have much to do with what we're going to talk about after that. But just for the sake of argument and just to see if you're aware of it, I also had come across something that suggested that a few years prior to this, that Constantine had also visited the temple of Apollo and had a vision of Apollo.
That's correct.
Were you aware of that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And so I guess, and I'm not going to read that part. I could read that. It was a very different thing, but it was also a similar thing where he visited the temple of Apollo, and Apollo appeared to him. And actually, Apollo's features were his own features, and he felt like that was affirming his divinity, and it was kind of a crazy thing. But anyway, that was prior to this experience. I don't know if the fact that he is prone to having visions of things like that is something, some other symptom that he may have. I don't know. I don't know what that is. At any rate, he has this He has another one.
Some say that about the Apostle Paul and his vision on the road to Damascus.
Right. And thank you for seeing, and that, I think to me that's valid, because I was thinking before the show about Constantine's conversion and how it compares to the vision from Paul the Apostle. So Paul the Apostle's vision, he's riding, a bright light knocks him from his horse. Those that rode with him said that it thundered, so they couldn't really make out the details of the voice. And he's blinded, but the difference, I mean, obviously there's differences there. One is that Jesus identifies himself as Jesus, and he commissions and calls Paul to stop what he's doing, and he transforms him completely. He even changes his name. He goes from Saul, the persecutor of the church, to Paul, the apostle of the church. And so there's a radical change.
His name doesn't change at the point of the vision. His name changes later on, actually.
Yeah, I understand in that second he didn't change his name, but as the result of that experience, he was transformed from the man who persecuted the church to someone who was one of the leaders within the church. And so there was a radical shift and transformation of his identity and his action and his heart and his, it completely transformed his life and turned it upside down. And we don't see that kind of conversion with Constantine, where before this happens, he's the emperor and he's going into battle and he's ruling, with the sword. And after it, he's still the emperor and he still goes into battle and he still rules with a sword. And that, I think, for me, as I'm looking at it, and as I've been reading about early church history and reading about Constantine, these were the things that troubled me, that caused me to question the validity of his conversion. And so that was one of the things. And you and I have already emailed back and forth and had some conversations about that. But as I presented it to you, if you had heard that I had a radical encounter with Christ and that my life had totally changed and now I was a follower of Jesus, but then you also heard that a few years later I put my son to death and then I put my wife to death, and that I refused to be baptized and I didn't ever attend any church services and I never submitted myself to any Christian leader or teacher or pastor or anything like that in my life. Those details, and by the way, each of those things are things that I can point to that Constantine did. Because Constantine supposedly, again, in his own words, he says he had a vision. Maybe he did. But what happened after that vision in his life, I would say, doesn't seem to echo and resonate with what you would expect to see when someone stands up and says, "This is my testimony. I once was blind and now I see. I was a sinner and Christ transformed me. I changed me. My life was never the same again. I wasn't the same person." Constantine,
I'm anxious to jump in here. I'm
wrapping it up. I'm wrapping it up. I promise. After his supposed conversion, Constantine ended up accusing his son of a crime and putting him to death. It was a capital punishment. A little bit after that, he discovered that those charges were probably trumped up by his wife and Fausta, and then he put her to death. And we do have evidence that he was sorrowful about his son. He even supposedly had built a monument for the son that he had killed. And I will also say the reaction of those Christian teachers within his own court after the death of his son, after Crispus's death, was disgust. A lot of them left and never returned because they were so disgusted that he had done that. So, and then we also again have the fact that Constantine did not submit himself to be baptized, even though he says he was a Christian, which, again, no other Christian at that time could say, "I'm a Christian," and then refuse baptism. And also, again, as I said, never really attended any churches or submitted themselves to the teaching of any Christian teacher or pastor or that kind of a thing. So because of those issues, I'm wrapping it up. Because of those things, when I look at those things about his life, I find it very difficult to say that guy was genuinely somebody who encountered the risen Christ and had a genuine conversion experience. So, Al, go ahead.
Well, two or three of the things you have mentioned are just not true, and that's part of why we're having this discussion. A lot of things said about Constantine, especially by Anabaptist, Free Church, pacifist Christian groups, have not been based on historical data. They've been based on false historical writings of men like the scholar we mentioned last week who inaccurately wrote some things. So there's a couple of things you mentioned that are indeed have historical data, but then there's a couple of things you said that are just flat out wrong. So if we're going to build a case against the man, let's at least use historical data to do it. And that was the genesis of our contact in the beginning. I was not complaining that you had a pacifistic view. I was complaining because you misrepresented the historical facts of what happened with the Donatists in that crisis in northern Africa that we discussed last week.
And, but I think it's independent of that. Like
I'm sorry?
The things I just said I didn't mention the Donatists at all. So what are the things that you specifically feel like are that I just said that are not historically accurate?
Right. Okay. Number one, Constantine is complained about right after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, when he enters Rome in celebration, like every Roman emperor who had ever done this before. There's a particular parade route that you're supposed to take that takes you to the what do they call it? Like the Shrine of Apollos or something. It was one of the pagan shrines in Rome where you offer an offering to the Roman gods. And Constantine refuses to do that. He goes to the church. So and he has complained. The complaint against him by the pagans of his day were that he had stopped worshiping with them, and all he did was go to church and worship with Christians. So I don't know where you get the data that he never went to church. That's just kind of amazing to me. That I don't even know where you got that. I'd like to see where you got it. So that's one. And that he didn't submit to any leadership is another one that I don't. Where did you get that? How did you come up with that? Where did you get that? I'm just curious.
Well, in what I read, I didn't find anything that I would say this is where Constantine put himself as a Christian under the authority of Christian leaders. So where did he do that? Can you give me some examples of where he did?
Well, let's see, his son Crispus was born in 302, I think. 302. And then 10 years later is when Constantine becomes emperor. And at that point, in 311, Constantine, becomes emperor, and his son is tutored by Lactantius. Lactantius had been a professor of rhetoric hired by Diocletian, and Lactantius is a Christian. He becomes one of the foremost Christian writers because of Constantine. But so Lactantius uses his institutes, his divine institutes, as a textbook to tutor Crispus. And what we see is that Constantine is reading divine institutes and apparently is having discussions with Lactantius through these years, leading up to his triumphant, movement as the sole ruler of Rome. He's reading Divine Institutes, and he's apparently conversing with Lactantius and, being schooled, if you will. I think the general feeling is that Lactantius is using his Divine Institutes and the Scripture as Constantine's catechism, teaching him what it means to be a Christian.
Okay. I will concede you that one.
I have a feeling let me just mention this. I have a feeling, because this is something I read consistently, and I think you made reference to it, that Constantine saw himself as an equal to the bishops, a bishop of bishops. Didn't you make that comment in an email to me?
Yes. And okay. I think that's specifically talking about the councils that he called, because no councils were ever called before that time. The church never felt the need, hey, we all got to have some council and get together and make some decisions about these things. And Constantine calls them all together, and so they come together at his request.
Well, look, that's not true either, Keith. There were numerous church councils before Constantine came on the scene. They just weren't as big. They were regional. They were smaller councils with bishops in a particular region. Yeah, he's the first who brings in what we would call ecumenical councils, where he's bringing bishops from all over the empire. But before that, in fact, that was one of the reasons that Constantine ends up, one of several reasons why he ends up declaring war against Licinius, is Licinius restricted the bishops from moving around, which kept the bishops from being able to have councils to discuss the problems they were encountering. And it stymied the organizational structure and the moving forward of decisions in the church. So, I don't know, but let me just comment about the bishop of bishops. That's quite important. Constantine never said that he was a bishop of bishops. He said in a gathering with bishops one particular time, and I don't remember where it was. I don't believe it was at a council. I don't remember where it was. But he makes the statement to them, you are bishops of the church within. And just as you are a bishop of the church within, God has made me bishop of the church of the outside, or without. In other words, he felt God had made him a bishop of the Roman Empire and all those who are not even in the church, trying to bring the whole empire into the church. And that's the comment he made about being a bishop. It had nothing to do with him saying, I'm a bishop just like you men. No, he was saying, I'm a bishop like you men, but I'm a bishop to the non-believers out there. So, yeah, I don't know. To say that he doesn't submit is another interesting accusation, because if you look closely, for example, to go back to the issue in Northern Africa with Donatus, he instructed the bishop. He instructed the bishops to deal with it. He said, can you, to the Roman bishop, can you go down to Africa and figure out, get these guys together, get them to agree, and put this thing to rest. And so the bishop goes, which, listen, for him to ask the bishop, or to tell the bishop to do that, number one, the Roman Augustus, the Roman ruler, senior Augustus, is the pontifex. He is supposed to be the leader of all the Roman religions, period. So when Constantine became the emperor, he saw himself as having a responsibility for all Romans and all religions. And so for him, he had heard complaints about the divisions among bishops. You had pagan writers and pagan comics making fun of Christianity because of their divisions, and that bothered Constantine. So he asked the Roman bishop, or told the Roman bishop, go and get this thing straightened out. So the Roman bishop called a council, So the first council ruled against Donatus, and Donatus didn't agree. He appealed. Constantine told him to have another council. They had another council. I mean, it was like the third time that they had the Council of Arles where Constantine showed up. It wasn't the first one. So he was trying
let me just say something. Let me just say something.
Well, let me just finish. He was trying to get the bishops to straighten it out, and once they failed, and Donatus appealed directly to Constantine, Constantine said, okay, I'm going to meet, we're going to get this thing settled, and, they didn't get it settled either, but, okay. Go ahead.
But, okay, and I understand that, but there's two things, though, to keep in mind, I think. One is that Constantine is still telling the bishops what to do, and two, they're on his payroll. So it's kind of hard to say he's not the boss when he's the guy cutting the checks, to put it in a colloquialism.
But that's something else you said last week, and that's not completely true either. He doesn't when you say you put him on his payroll, you made that statement last week. What are you referring to? Tell me what you mean by that. Because it's easy to make a statement like that, and the implications of it are drawn in every mind that hears you, whether they know anything about the historical data or not. They draw conclusions from a broad brush statement like that. So I want you to explain, when you say that, what exactly are you meaning by that? What are you referring to?
Okay, that the bishops within the church were elevated to the level of Roman senators. They were they were invited to the same parties. They were given that same level of respect within the community, which of course that had not been done before. And they were financially supported. They were given temples. Pagan temples were converted into Christian temples, and they were given a stipend by the Roman government. That's what I mean by putting them on the payroll.
Okay, and you mentioned something else that's not completely true either right there about giving them pagan temples and converting it to churches. I know of one instance of that. I don't believe that happened in broad brush.
He built them churches.
Well, but that's different from giving them pagan temples. And that's what you just said. He gave them pagan temples.
Okay. So he gave them pagan temples once or twice, and then built them temples or churches.
Well, and the once that I know of it's a very unusual situation. I mean, and that's my point, is that's to make a statement like that in the minds of someone who is in the minds of a normal layperson who hasn't read Eusebius, who has never read Lactantius, who's never read any of these early writings, it puts an implication in their mind that, man, every Christian bishop in the whole Roman Empire was receiving their paycheck from Constantine. And what you just said kind of implied that when I asked you to explain. And that's just simply not true. He doesn't put every bishop on his payroll. I mean, where did you get that?
What I came across in my studies. So if you want to demonstrate that isn't the case.
Well, listen. Here's the thing: when you make comments like that, like I did with you in the Northern Africa dispute, I demand to see where you got it. And in that instance with the Donatus, you pointed me to a textbook where you got it, or a writing where you got it, and it just so happens that the man who you read it in was quoting another man who was completely wrong in his assessments. It was all assessments. Neither of them pointed to any primary documentation. They made assumptions based on scanty historical data. And so when I hear things like that, I press people. I want to know where you got that information, because I'm going to track it down. And you know me, Keith. I tracked it down. And I tracked it down. Listen, I didn't track it down principally to prove you wrong. I tracked it down because I wanted to know what was correct. I wanted to know what the historical data is. And in this instance, where he put him on his payroll, he restored to Christians what was taken from them under Diocletian in particular, where churches had been destroyed, where churches had been taken, and where where churches had their monies and their wealth taken from them by the Roman government. Constantine said all of that needs to be given back. Restitution needs to be made, and if you had a church building destroyed, then I'm telling the governor, build you another church. And he did urge the bishops, take advantage of this. Press your governors to build you a church. Yeah, he did do that. And he went beyond that. He gave monetary gifts to bishops. Yes, he did. I think at the Council of Nicaea he gave bishops monetary gifts. Here he was going around the hall and greeting and kissing the nubbed fingers that had been hacked off by soldiers, and kissing the empty eye sockets where martyrs had had their eyes gouged out, and blessing them, and probably feeling moved by what they had suffered. He gave some of them little bags of silver or silver coins or some of his bronze coins that he circulated. But you got to understand, and now we will eventually get to where you ask me, what impact he had on the early church, and do I think it was all good? Because I don't want anyone to think that I do think all of this is just fine and dandy and that there weren't any unintended consequences. There were plenty of unintended bad consequences that
let me I totally agree with you. I'm sorry.
Let me finish one point about giving away money to the priests to the bishops.
And then I want to get back to this other stuff.
Okay. How do you think the Roman emperors generated commerce? They printed coins. They printed bronze and silver coins that had intrinsic value, and they gave it away. That's how they put money in circulation. So normal Romans were given money, the great celebration. And did he give monies to bishops? Yes. But to say he put all the Christian men on payroll, and you said he elevated them to the senator status. I mean, think about that now. He elevated every single bishop to the status of a senator? How do you think that would go over across the Roman Empire? Where would they all meet? I mean, that's absurd. Did he raise some bishops to the status of senators? Yes. But not every single bishop. I mean, it was mainly in Rome where that kind of thing happened. And he did shower the Roman bishop with a lot of he gave him a palace. I mean, he did give the Roman bishop a lot of stuff. That's true. Right.
Okay, so I want to go back to because I started off giving a list of things that for me were problematic in making the case that Constantine had a genuine conversion. And so your response was that most of what I said, or a lot of what I said, wasn't factual, and you've already pointed out a couple of things. But some of the specific things that I said that I want you to respond to are the fact that Constantine was not baptized until he was on his deathbed, and that he put his son to death and he put his wife to death.
Let's deal with the baptism thing. Because when you mention 4 or 5 things, it gets into the minds of anyone listening. And I'm telling you, I think the implications go deep. And then they may not listen to me give an explanation. And so here we are, 4 or 5 issues have been thrown out on the wall to see what sticks. And they may not stick around to hear me give my explanation for one of those 4 that sticks in their craw. So let's deal with the baptism. He is not the only Christian in the early church who didn't get baptized until his deathbed. It didn't start with Constantine. It didn't end with Constantine. The context of that is quite important. In the early church, there was the belief that once you were baptized, you could not commit a mortal sin and be immediately forgiven and granted back into the good graces of the fellowship. And a mortal sin was apostasy during persecution, adultery, probably prostitution or fornication with prostitutes, and murder. Okay? And so even in the early church, some people, because of this issue that's called second repentance, there are a lot of Christians who are afraid to get baptized. They're afraid to get baptized because they're afraid they might sin. And once they sin, according to their understanding, now listen, the fact of the matter is, if you read the church fathers, nobody says that. Nobody says you can't be saved after you've committed a mortal sin, after you've been baptized. What they do say is the bishop cannot pronounce you forgiven. And a lot of bishops did that. A lot of bishops, used the text that, I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom. What you loose shall be loosed. What you bind shall be bound. And so bishops would proclaim over people, you have been forgiven. And some of the church fathers, Tertullian in particular, said that's just ridiculous. No bishop can forgive your sins. Now, if you had asked a bishop, he would have said, well, I'm certainly not forgiving their sins. I'm assuring them that God forgives their sins. But in the early church, there's great angst over whether you can be forgiven and saved after you're baptized if you commit a mortal sin.
Right.
Venial sins, Tertullian himself said you can't worry about venial sins. We all commit venial sins. You'd be interested in the list that Tertullian gives for venial sins, but, that nonetheless they aren't the mortal sins. So Constantine, knowing this tradition, he fears, because he knows as an emperor, he has to put people to death. It's part of his job, is to put people to death. It's the death penalty. And he doesn't want to get baptized because he has the fear that, what if I can't be forgiven, so I'm going to wait till I'm on my deathbed. So,
right.
Now,
okay,
do I agree with that? Do I agree with that? No. But see, Keith, I don't agree with the way the early church dealt with second repentance anyway.
Right.
I don't think we should ever say you can't be forgiven for any sin. I just think that's ridiculous. That's not the New Testament.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
And so I don't agree with the early church's teachings on that before Constantine was ever born. I don't agree with what the early church taught. And that's part of why I'm asked all the time, you seem to be so apologetic for the Orthodox and the Catholics. Why don't you become one? Because I couldn't agree with everything. They demand that you believe certain things, and I can't. I can't believe everything the early church fathers taught as tradition just because they taught it. I remain kind of a Reformation, New Testament-based Christian. I have a hard time breaking away from that completely. So.
Right. And so this dovetails into the next step, the next part of it. So Constantine decides to postpone his baptism to Christ because he knows he's probably going to have to administer the death penalty, and he doesn't want to jeopardize his eternal salvation. But then, of course, that was a wise thing because he ends up killing not just all the other people that he ended up having to administer the death penalty to, but his own son and later his wife. So and the issues of that, and Al, I don't want to get way too deep in the weeds of what happened and what was because in a nutshell, what happened was we don't know. There's two different theories. One is that he and his stepmother Fausta were having an affair. The other one is that she wanted to get rid of him so that her sons could sit on the throne. We don't know which is true, and frankly, here's something that's troubling to me. One of the reasons we don't know really is that most of the Christian historians at the time completely ignored that this even happened, and I think it's because they were very favorable to Constantine, and they didn't want to bring this up because it was a very not just an emotionally painful thing. I think it was an embarrassing thing. And as I said, a lot of, or at least one of the Christian, and it might have been Lactantius, left the court once this happened. Probably, as you mentioned, because he had tutored and taught Crispus as a young boy.
Yes.
And so,
and I don't know.
So the judgment.
I don't know that Lactantius left, but it wouldn't surprise me that he left because of exactly what you said. He tutored Crispus as a boy, and he probably was devastated, and he probably was angry. I mean, there's a lot of anger going around over this thing. So,
right.
But I don't know that. Earlier you said a lot of Christian men left the service of Constantine, and I want to see where that. I've never heard that, and I would want to see that somewhere.
No, I will take that back. What I was referring to was Lactantius in his court, and the source that I have says that he left in disgust after that because of what had happened, and he felt it was an unjustified act.
Well, yeah, and so it was certainly unjustified, and that's why Constantine agonized after he did it, because he realized after the fact that it was stupid. So
right. So and now, okay. So those are the last issues, and then there was one other thing, and you and I talked about this in the email, and I didn't mention it.
Can I just comment on?
Oh yeah, go ahead. But then I want to mention one other thing. But go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It's just really important when again, a lot of people don't know. A lot of people know 1/10 of what you know about Constantine, and they're going to hear what you say, and they're going to make implications. They're going to have their own assumptions they jump to. Crispus was his first son under a different wife. His first wife, Minerva, died shortly after childbirth. She probably had complications delivering Crispus, and she died. And it was and that in and of itself was difficult for Constantine, but hey, he had a son, and as anybody knows anything about the ancient world, having a son was a great thing. So he made special efforts to have Crispus well educated, because he wanted Crispus to follow in his footsteps as a Roman emperor. His mother, my mind's gone blank. I can't remember Constantine's mother's name. Anyway, his mother raised Crispus. So Crispus is raised by his grandmother, Helena. Helena raised Crispus. And then Constantine gets Lactantius to be his tutor, and there is a sense that Constantine comes to faith through Lactantius and his writings that his son is already reading and becoming very, very, familiar with and cordial with. So if you think about it, there's this emotional pull on Constantine into Christian faith through how his son is being trained. And so there's a deep connection. Every writer will tell you Constantine loved Crispus dearly. He had groomed him to be an emperor. He had served with him as a Caesar. He had trained him in military, strategy. And Crispus was showing himself to be a great general, just like his father had been. And his plan was to make Crispus his joint ruler of Rome, probably make him another Augustus. So they're en route to Rome. And as they're en route with his whole family, Constantine gathered his whole family, his mother, his children with Fausta, Crispus, and they're all en route, this one big, imperial family. And along the way, he passes some laws that make stricter punishment for sexual crimes in the Roman Empire. He makes it more strict punishment for rape. He makes more strict punishment for adultery. He makes more. I think the death penalty is now on the table for adultery and things like this. And so he's passing these laws, thinking in his mind that he's pushing the empire towards Christianity by doing this. And we can debate whether that's good or not. I personally don't think the death penalty is a good idea for someone who commits adultery. I mean, I think that, but it's a different time period, right? So suddenly, his wife, his second wife, Fausta, comes to him like Potiphar's wife and Joseph, and accuses his son of trying to rape her. And Constantine flies off the handle. He challenges Crispus. Crispus denies it, and Constantine won't listen. He flies off the handle and condemns him to death. He sends him out with a couple of his generals out by the seaside, and on the beach, Crispus drinks poison and dies. And Constantine is extremely upset about the whole thing. He doesn't like it. He's unhappy with his son's infidelity, but he's also unhappy that he put his son to death. They get to Rome, and when his mother Helena, you know what, I messed the story up. Helena is actually waiting for them in Rome. And when they arrive in Rome, Helena hears what happened, and she immediately attacks Constantine. Why did you do this? And he tells her why. And she said, I don't believe it. And she storms out of his presence, and she goes and starts asking people who were there, and she ends up coming back and saying, I don't believe Crispus did that. I believe Fausta put him up to it, and blah. You know, it was a not put him up to it, but was what do you call it? A plot by Fausta,
right.
And she accuses Fausta. Now there's history behind Fausta and Helena that's not good, and I won't go into the weeds of that, but there's historical issues between them as family members that were not good. They never liked each other, and so there's feeling that Fausta is, not only does she want her sons to be the next rulers, but she's also jealous of Crispus because he is Constantine's firstborn son. For numerous years, Fausta was denigrated by the Roman public for not bearing Constantine a son. And so there's bitterness towards Crispus by Fausta. Well, anyway, so Helena makes this accusation. Constantine, she comes back and tells him of witnesses who say this, that, and the other thing. Constantine, gets kind of angry again and calls Fausta into his presence and says, this is what's being said. Is this true? And Fausta admits it. Yes, it's true. Crispus never attempted to rape me. I made it all up. And Constantine then has her put to death. He sends her to a bathhouse, has her drink. He has the attendants with her give her more wine than she should ever drink for sitting in a sauna. And anybody who knows about whirlpool baths, if you drink alcohol and you get in 105 degree water, you're not going to make it. And that's how she died. Now, do I think that, and it's called the imperial tragedy, and do I think that was bad? Yes, I think that was bad. Do I think that calls for anyone to say he could not have been a Christian because of that? I just think that's not right. I think that's not fair. That's not an accurate reading of the story, and it's, I don't know, like Tertullian says, if there's not forgiveness for sins, none of us shall be saved. So I think it was a terrible thing, but Constantine was the ruler of the emperor. He was the ruler of the empire. He had just drafted new laws to make it punishable by death, what he should have done. I mean, see, it's easy now, and I think Lactantius, I don't know the story with he and Lactantius, but I would not be surprised if Lactantius was highly upset by that for one big reason. Constantine never had a hearing and let Crispus try to defend himself. And
I think that's the sort of the thing too, is that it was such an emotional decision. He just basically was angry and had him killed. He didn't let's have a trial and who are the witnesses and let's calmly consider. It seemed like he was rushing to kill his own son. Why would you be in such a hurry? You think you'd be going, well, hang on now, this is my son. I don't want to do this. Let me let's get all the facts. It reminds one of the story of Saul and Jonathan in the Old Testament when Saul
commanded that no one eat or drink, and Jonathan thought that was stupid and tasted honey and gained strength. And when Saul heard about it, he wanted to put his own son to death, and everyone, I think if I remember the story right, they all talked him out of it because it was great love for Jonathan. But you're exactly right. Constantine screwed up, and he lived the rest of his life. The scholar that I'm reading, he's the foremost Constantinian scholar really in the world, probably ever. He wrote the definitive biography of Constantine. He believes, and I've been reading his book the last 4 months. I've been working through his book.
Who is that?
Charles O'Dall. Charles O'Dall, Constantine and the Christian Empire. He was professor emeritus of Boise State University. He's a classicist, and he wrote the biography of Constantine that is, he's the one I think I told you about. He spent 31 years studying the life of Constantine. I mean, it's amazing. He's an amazing scholar, and I've interacted with him in probably 3 dozen emails, asking him questions, challenging what he says, and getting his answers. But Charles O'Dall believes, and I think he's right, that Constantine, almost everything he does after the death of Crispus, he's trying to find penance. He's trying to make penance because he knows what he did was so bad that he agonizes. And so he's building churches. He's doing things that you and I think are ridiculous. Just why don't you just throw yourself on the mercy of God? And I'm sure he was doing that too. But, look, he was agonizing over it, and I can't even imagine what that was like. So, all right, so that's that one.
Okay, so can I just want to bring this up because this is something, I didn't mention it in my beginning statement. I apologize, I left this part out, so I'm not trying to spring it on you. But you and I did interact about this in our email conversation a few weeks ago. And this to me is another, and this is coming from, I'm quoting from a book which I don't think you have much respect for, Constantine the Great by Michael Grant. And in this book, he is quoting from, he's quoting from H.A. Drake, and the book is In Praise of Constantine. And here he says, in the stories about Jesus that one finds, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, Constantine took no interest at all. Indeed, Jesus' doings did not seem to him of any importance, nor even did the person of Jesus himself, since although Constantine felt able to quote or rather misquote Virgil's 4th Eclogue as forecasting the incarnation, blah, 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 he also rebuked his half-sister, this is the issue, he also rebuked his half-sister Constantia for excessively revering what a likeness of Jesus, whose actual existence on earth as a human being did not seem to him a matter worth dwelling upon at all. Nor would he have been able to see the point of Jesus' crucifixion, at least without some mental acrobatics. It was embarrassing, to say the least, that God's own Son had been subjected to this humiliating end, and contemporary Christian art avoids this whole question because it seemed to involve such ignominy. And for this reason, Constantine abolished crucifixion as a punishment. And then I'm going to jump down. He says, Constantine hardly ever mentions the theology which proclaimed and explained the crucifixion, and he saw the cross not so much as an emblem of suffering as a magic totem confirming his own victoriousness. So that, and you may have a challenge to that assessment, to that quote.
Michael Grant, what's the text?
And this is a quote from Drake's book, In Praise of Constantine.
What book is it that Michael Grant? What's the title of Michael Grant?
Oh, Grant's book is called Constantine the Great, The Man in His Times.
And he's quoting Drake?
Yes.
Okay. And Drake's, what's a volume by Drake again?
This is, it says 1975, doesn't say what volume, page 153.
Well, I'll look it up. I'll be able to find it.
This is the book, Al. This is the book that one of the books I was reading, and the other one was a few books by your good friend, Justo Gonzalez. But
now look.
No, but let me
I'm not meaning to impugn Justo Gonzalez as a Christian. I think he is a great man, a great Christian. and I don't doubt his faith at all.
That. But I do understand that you don't agree with his scholarship on things. But anyway, let's go back to the Michael Grant quote here, which is quoting the Drake book. And so this is the book, Al, that I'm reading when I'm doing my studies on Constantine. And then I come across not only the things I just told you, which I understand your perspective on why he wasn't baptized, and your perspective on the way he treated the bishops, and your perspective on putting his son to death and then his wife to death, etc. I understand that. And then I read this, and I see that it seems that if his vision at the bridge was genuine, that he didn't understand it, and that he didn't really understand the gospel clearly, because if he's as he's saying here, he's rebuking his sister for worshiping an image of Christ or the likeness of Christ. The Christian art of the time avoids Christ on the cross. He shows no interest in these kinds of things. The crucifixion itself is something that he avoided. Then it seems to me that, how can I put this? It's like if I heard similar things about Tertullian, for example, I would say, wow, that guy's probably not a Christian, because that doesn't seem right. That just seems, why would you have that attitude about the cross? If you don't understand what was happening at the cross, if you don't understand the true significance of the cross of Christ, have you really truly come to a saving knowledge of Christ? And again, these are the things that, as I was studying it, I arrived at the conclusions that I arrived at, which are different than the ones you arrived at.
Well, and here's what I'm going to tell you, okay? And look, I know I've already for those who listen to this podcast, you need to realize that if you talk to me about football, I'm going to get fired up about football. If you talk to me about politics, I'm going to get fired. I'm a passionate person. So earlier when it sounded like I was, angry at Keith. Some people have accused me, I've been accused of numerous times. I don't want to sound sexist, but I've had women tell me, stop yelling at me. And I'm like, I'm not yelling. I'm just intense.
I don't feel that you're angry at me, Al, just so you know. For people listening, I don't feel any heat at all from you. We're totally cool.
Well, for the listeners, though, I want you to understand that I'm passionate. And what I'm about to say to Keith is not meant disrespectfully, but this is what I would say to you. I've already shown you on 2 or 3 occasions that what you have read in some other scholarly works were not accurately reflecting the historical data. So I want to urge you, when you're reading Michael Grant or anybody, look up the primary source. When they make a statement like the one you just made about he rebuked his sister for something, you need to, if you want, look, here's the problem, Keith, and I understand this. I'm sitting here with Charles O'Donnell's book in front of me. It's 360-something pages. No, it's 400 pages. It's literally 100 pages of footnotes. 100 pages of footnotes. I read almost every word of almost every footnote. I do that because that's my job. I've been trained to be a scholar and to make sure that what I hear is correct. And, I wrote O'Donnell an email a couple nights ago and told him, look, because I'm asking him about another scholar that I'm taking issue with, and I wanted to know his opinion. And O'Donnell made some comments back to me, and I told him that, listen, when I read your book, I read footnotes, I read primary sources of everything you cite for probably the majority of your footnotes, because I wanted to make sure you were accurately reflecting the primary documents. And the fact is, I have not found one single time when O'Donnell misrepresents the primary documents. But that's how I learn to trust somebody, is I check them out. I'm a Berean. I want to make sure that what they're telling me is accurate. And so what I would challenge you, Keith, is do that, because there are plenty of people out there who have PhDs like me and who misrepresent the data. because they have an agenda. And, you know, I have an agenda. We all have agendas. But the role of a scholar is to give you the evidence from which they get their opinion. And if they don't accurately reflect the data, then I'm sorry, that's bad scholarship. Number one, if they don't even point you to primary source, that's just not good scholarship. I mean, that's just lazy opinion, and it's just not good. You would never get a PhD in Scotland, where I got my PhD from the University of St. Andrews. If you did that, you're not going to get a PhD.
Right.
If you don't cite primary sources. If you misrepresent primary sources, you will not get a PhD. That's just the way it is, and that's the way it ought to be. But we get men who are tenured, and they've written numerous books, and they get lazy, and they start just giving you their opinion without feeling any responsibility to tell you where they got that opinion. So when I'm looking up Michael Grant on this crucifixion thing, let me read to you what I'm looking at, and you tell me if it sounds familiar. He does not violate Christian belief as much as minimize those aspects which were unique or exclusive. And as we have seen, he sidesteps the difficulties of the crucifixion and resurrection and only makes oblique reference to the incarnation. That sounds very similar to what you just read, doesn't it?
It's similar, yes.
Who do you think this guy's talking about? He's not talking about Constantine. He's talking about Eusebius. And I want to look up Michael Grant, but I have a funny feeling that this is where you just got what you just read. I think came from here. He's not talking about Constantine. He's talking about Eusebius. Now look, Eusebius had his own issues theologically. I mean, that's kind of my point. We're dealing with, I mean, early church history it's like I told you last week. I went to study early church history because I wanted to figure out how the church, when they really got it right, how did they do it so we could replicate it? And what I found out was they didn't get it right.
Yeah, it's a mess. I totally agree.
All kinds of things. And
if you want to get depressed, read church history. Yeah, it's encouraging in some ways, but it's depressing in other ways. Some things they did get right, other things they did get wrong.
But listen, it's depressing when you're looking at it as a panacea. When you're looking at it as trying to find the golden egg, or what is it called in Monty Python? What is it called?
Holy
Grail. If you look at the early church as the Holy Grail, then it becomes depressing. But see, I don't do it that. I look at the early church fathers as sinners, just like me, and just like you. And
they weren't inspired.
And they had opinions that were wrong, just like you and just like me. And
let me ask you something. Can I ask you something real quick? I want to go back to the Eusebius thing, and I'm asking you just man to man what you think. So the comment about Eusebius is very similar to, like as you noted, is very similar to the comment that Grant makes quoting Drake about Constantine. So let me just ask you: is it possible that Constantine's theology was influenced by Eusebius?
All right. Is it possible? First of all, let me just say this. I wasn't reading out of Michael Grant. I was reading out of the Drake. I was reading out of Drake's text in praise of Constantine. So
no, I understand that. But my question is, I
understand, but I wanted to make
Constantine
I'm
is being advised
scholar, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that I was not reading from Michael Grant. I was reading from Drake. Okay. Now,
but I'm saying if that's the theology that he's exposed to, that Constantine is exposed to in his court, these are the people that he is looking to as, hey, tell me about Christianity. What is it? If these are the guys that he's hearing from, and this is the kind of flavor he's getting from them, then wouldn't that make sense that kind of is going to color and influence his own understanding of theology?
Okay. I'm gonna answer that in two ways. Number one, it could be exactly that. You might be right, and it could have influenced Constantine. However, the evidence we have is that Constantine is more influenced by Lactantius than he is Eusebius. And by the way, when I read this about Eusebius, I don't know which Eusebius Drake is talking about because I haven't read Drake. He could be talking about Eusebius of Nicomedia. There were two Eusebiuses, and the Eusebius of Nicomedia was an Arian. He was a known supporter of Arius, and so I don't know. And I'd have to read this text more closely to find out which Eusebius. Look, I'll tell you what. It's not depressing. Church history isn't depressing. It's just complicated. That's what it is. It's complicated. And it doesn't lend itself. And this is really important for our discussion. Early church history does not lend itself for proof texting. Oh, I have a theological perspective. Let me prove it by the early church fathers. You're going to find yourself in trouble when you do that because the church fathers are all over the place. I agree. You can get one who says one thing and another who disagrees with you. So, but I don't believe that Constantine is primarily influenced by either Eusebius. I think Constantine is primarily influenced by Lactantius. Now, does that? But see, you also have to realize, does that bother me? What I just read, minimizing. He sidesteps the difficulties of the crucifixion and the resurrection. First of all, what does he mean by that? He sidesteps the difficulties, and he only makes oblique reference to the incarnation. I mean, I'm afraid, Keith, that when you read that, you come to conclusions and assumptions based on the lens that you're already looking through. I mean, when I read that, I don't know what he means by that. The difficulties of the crucifixion. I'll tell you a difficulty right now, the crucifixion that I wrestle with. If Jesus is equal to God and was coexistent with God forever and ever from eternity, how could he die? How could he die? Did he cease to exist? I mean, we're told by the scriptures and by early church history that we believe he actually went to hell to deliver the captives or whatever, but how did God die? Is it amazing? I preached a sermon one time on Good Friday when God died. There are all kinds of difficulties, I think, and that doesn't mean. So when I read this, when I read that Eusebius sidestepped the difficulties of crucifixion and resurrection, number one, he has a footnote and I can't see it. I'm in Google Books, so I'm going to have to do digging to find out I want to know where he gets this idea so I can read Eusebius. I don't care look, Drake, I'm going to read Drake, but I don't really care what Drake thinks. I really don't. I want to know what Eusebius thinks. And if Drake helps me read Eusebius, that's a good thing. But Eusebius, look, if he's talking about Eusebius of Caesarea, which I'm guessing he is, but I don't know that, because both Eusebiuses served under Constantine, both of them. Yeah. And so you are correct. It is possible that Eusebius was influenced by the theology. That Constantine was influenced by Eusebius. That is possible. Okay, I don't want to make it sound like I think that's impossible, because no, I can never say that. It is possible. But Eusebius of Caesarea, I always tell people when they start hammering on me about my views about the New Testament canon, Eusebius didn't think the book of Revelation should be in the New Testament. He thought it was ridiculous. And the early church, the church leaders of the day of Constantine, they thought the 1,000-year reign of Christ had started with Constantine. Now, you and I think that's ridiculous. But if we had just watched a bunch of our friends be executed and thrown to the wolves and thrown to the bears and ripped to shreds, and we had seen soldiers sticking a spear into a pregnant woman's abdomen and killing her and her fetus because they were Christian, and then we had an emperor come up who claimed to be Christian and showed us by every action towards the Christians that he was a Christian, we might, their world radically changed right in front of their eyes.
Right.
We might be inclined to think, oh my gosh, maybe this is the rule of Christ. I mean, you and I think it's ridiculous, but I just think we have to give them a little bit of slack. And, you know, as wrong as they were. I mean, and look, if we get into it, I hope we do, talk about the influence of Constantine, there were a lot of unintended consequences that were bad. And I'll be the first to talk about this.
Well, go ahead.
I just don't like blame. I don't like blaming Constantine. Listen, I referenced in an email to you, and this could lead to our next talk. I referenced to you an email that I felt like you were judging Constantine, and if you do that, then you better be ready to judge Martin Luther, John Calvin, you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and a lot of the other icons. And I mean, John Calvin, a lot of bad things, unintended consequences happened from his Geneva experiment. But do I think he was a Christian? I do. Do I agree with his theology? No. But do I agree with the way he ran Geneva, he and his buddies? No. But I think they were trying their best to do something for the glory of God. Now, you and I know that sounds ridiculous when you think about the fact that they put Michael Servetus to death because he disagreed with
and cheered about it. They were thrilled about it. In fact, I think it was Calvin that said he wishes he could be there personally.
You know, I was going to say he wasn't there when it happened, and he actually, you know, wasn't involved in the first-hand account. But you know, and I don't remember if he said that. It wouldn't surprise me. I don't know.
No,
I don't know.
I think he did. I think I came across a quote where he had not only approved of it, he had something else he couldn't be there, and he said he wished he could be there to do it. See it personally.
Let me make a comment about this because it's tangential, but it makes a lot of sense with what we're talking about. One complaint that people have against Constantine, and this is one piece of evidence. I hate to give you any more evidence because you already have things that you don't like about him, but I'm going to give you one.
Okay.
It is true that before Constantine, no bishop could ever be exiled. Constantine is the one who brought that into play. Sending bishops to, you know, some remote place because they didn't agree with the theology that they had set up. I mean, the church couldn't do that because, quite frankly, the church didn't have the muscle to do it. The church, you know, now you have read, and you made reference last week, there were already violent things that happened in the early church before Constantine. But church leaders didn't go and exile. How are you going to exile somebody? Especially if they have a group of 30 people behind them who are willing to go fisticuffs, willing to swing clubs and axes. I mean, you better be ready for a lot of bloodshed. But when Constantine comes on the scene, he's the emperor. So he could send a group of Roman soldiers and they could grab the guy and they marched him into, who knows, Bithynia somewhere and set him on a mountain area. So I'm speaking of areas. And that never happened before Constantine. And when I first started reading about that, I thought, oh my gosh, that is really stupid. And that really leads to bad things after Constantine, where Christian leaders put people to death, which is that's the natural conclusion. If you can exile them, why can't you kill them? Optatus comes to that view, which is unfortunate.
Yes.
But the reason Constantine exiled them, and this is really important. For example, in North Africa, they kept ruling against Donatus, and Donatus would talk about not willing to submit. Donatus refused to submit to the leadership of the church. He just refused. And he had a bunch of people behind him, and they encouraged him, no, we're not going to submit. And they kept stirring up trouble. So it was only after the Donatus crisis when Constantine orders that the peace be kept, and there is shedding of blood, and Christians died. And believe me, Constantine never believed the Donatists were schismatic. He believed they were schismatics, but he never believed that they were not Christian. Other Orthodox bishops wanted to de-Christianize them, but Constantine never believed that. He always wanted them back in the church. But when those people died, Constantine got it in his head, okay, that didn't work. I'll never do that again. We're not going to come to those kind of blows. So
but as you said,
under Arius, what he did, he exiled Arius. And he did it because he did not want Arius to go back to his community in Egypt and stir up trouble and keep his followers following him. And he figured the only way to get rid of this guy's trouble is to send him to a far-off region where he can't do anybody any harm. And that didn't work either. Arius escapes and goes to Palestine and gets some bishops who support him, and they end up, it ends up being a mess. So, but, do I think that's a good thing? No. Believe me, there's so many stupid things that you read about. But, Keith, don't we read about stupid things now? I mean, Christians have always done stupid things. And doing stupid things doesn't make you not a Christian. It just means you let your sinful nature dominate you for however long of a period of time. And, I'm just not willing to judge Constantine. First of all, like I've said, my first priority is to set the record straight. Let's not say things that are not substantiated by the historical data. Now, if you want to argue, we've set out the historical data. If you want to still say, well, I don't see how a Christian could have put his son to death, I can respect that. I disagree. I think it'd be tragic. But look, if I was a judge and I thought my son committed a heinous crime, and the death penalty is part of our culture and part of our legal system, yeah, I'd put my son to death. I'd hate it, and I'd probably live the rest of my life regretting it, but I would do it because I believe in law and justice. But, do I think that means he can't be a Christian? No, I think that's a very harsh conclusion to come to unless you can give me more data, more information. And so far, a lot of the complaints that you tell me, in my opinion, and I personally would challenge you, give me historical data, and I will re-examine it. But there are too many things you've said that are just flat out not based on any historical facts. And I don't know Michael Grant. I've never read him. I've never read Drake. And I'm going to. When we get off this call, I need you to email me kind of the thing. I'll probably remember it, but what I'd really like is the page number from Michael Grant, so I can track him back to what page he cites Drake and all that kind of stuff. But
I can give you the reference he has of that.
But anyway, look, in the end, my objective is not to say Constantine is the greatest. Okay, I'm not saying that, but I'm also opposed to laying the blame at his feet for all the ailments. I mean, I have shown in other articles I've written, that is a trajectory that came out of the Anabaptist movement that is just based on fraudulent documents and stuff that didn't ever happen. And people restating unhistorical opinion. And I just think that doesn't serve anybody. I don't think that helps God. It doesn't help his kingdom. And, someone asked me a couple weeks ago, someone asked me, Al, have you ever thought that when you go to heaven that you might meet Constantine? And I told him, it's funny you asked me that, because a couple of weeks ago I was driving my car and I was thinking, when I get to heaven, if Constantine is there, and I expect he will be, but I could be wrong, I hope I'm there. I think I will be, but,
That's what I'm most concerned about, personally. As long as I'm there, I don't really care who's there.
I mean, I don't really. If I can be a doorkeeper, I'll be thrilled.
Sure.
Let me tell you.
I'll be homeless on the streets of gold. I would happily sleep on the streets there. No problem.
Well, there you go. But I guess to me, I don't want to face Constantine or any Christian in heaven and have them. Not that they would. Quite frankly, I don't think this will happen in heaven.
Right. No, I know what you're saying.
I want them to say, why did you tell lies about it? And me have to say, because lying about a Christian who's dead, I mean, first of all, they're not really dead. If they're Christians, they're not dead. They're
but they're not around to defend themselves.
No, but saying a lie about a fellow Christian now, if you know, the fact is a lot of people say things and they don't know that they're telling a lie. So it's not a lie if you don't know it. But you get my point. We don't want to malign Christians unless we know the facts. And even if we know the facts, for example, what John Calvin did. When I was a younger man as an Anabaptist, quite frankly, I didn't think John Calvin was saved, and I was taught that Calvinism was the doctrine of demons. And to this day, I'm not a Reformed theologian. I don't buy Reformed theology.
Yep, neither am I. No, I'm not either.
But neither do I condemn John Calvin or any of his followers. I can't condemn them. I mean, I don't know them. I don't know their hearts. I don't know. When I read Calvin's Institutes, I've read parts of Calvin's Institutes. When you're reading his Institutes, you do not get the feeling that this is a demon. You get the feeling that this is a man who loves the Word of God and is trying his best to understand it. I mean, we pick on the small things, and I'll admit to you, Servetus, however you say his name, for him it was not a small thing that he was killed. John Knox. My wife is a direct descendant of John Knox, the great Scottish reformer. When I lived in St. Andrews, I did a lot of reading and studying about the Reformation in St. Andrews, where they killed the bishop. There's a couple places in St. Andrews where you have people's initials in the stones in the streets to mark where Scottish reformers, young men, were burned at the stake by the Catholics. Well, my wife's ancestor, John Knox, led an angry mob on a 9-mile march from Crail. And when they got to St. Andrews, they beat Catholics. They destroyed their buildings and all their cathedral, and they whipped them and scourged them and ran them out of town. And some Catholics were put to death during that whole angry mob mentality. And none of the Catholics are ever referred to as martyrs. And now, my point is not that I think the Catholics were right. The Catholics did stupid things during this period. And I believe John Knox was saved. I believe John Knox was a man of God. But leading an angry mob and beating people in the streets, I mean, I just think that's stupid. It's ridiculous. But again, Keith, I didn't live in that period. You know, I don't know what all drove them, the anger, the bitterness, and should they have let Christ rule the day? Sure, they should have. The fact that they didn't, though, to me, I can't draw a line and say they cannot have been Christian. They could not have been Christians. Were they acting Christianly? No. Could they have been saved? I think they could have been, So, I don't know.
No, and I agree with you in the sense, yes, that I don't envy the position of my goal is not to sit here and say who else is not saved, and it's not my job to say who's saved and who isn't. But I do think that, and as something that I said in the email conversation that you and I had, I do think though. For me, again, I think you and I look at some of the same data and we interpret it through a different, lens. But for me, it's an uphill battle if you're going to take the position to look at the data and say, I'm going to make the case that Constantine's conversion was genuine. Because I personally don't see what I would say would be the kinds of things I would expect to see. And in fact, what I see is a lot of things that make me kind of go, that's unusual, and again, we've already gone over most of those things. So I think it's just that I look at some of those things and I say, well, I don't know. I'm not seeing some things that I would have expected to see. I don't think these things correlate to what I see when I look at the testimonies of other people who have come to Christ. And so anyway, I don't want to sit here and say Constantine is not saved, but what I do want to say is that when I look at that data, I think it's an uphill battle. And again, you see it differently, but I look at it and say I think it's an uphill battle to look at that data and conclude conclusively, absolutely, he had a genuine conversion. I'm not sure, But again, it's not my.
I don't mind.
It's not the call is not up to me.
I do not. It doesn't bother me for someone to say, I don't know if he was saved or not. But remember now, some of the things that you mentioned that gave you pause, some of them are just flat out not true. And some of them are your opinion of reading and making assumptions, like the not wanting to be baptized till he died. That's difficult for you and me to understand. But we didn't live in that second repentance issue, man. That was a terrible time for the church. I mean, you mentioned Cyprian. That's where he really came into his own, is dealing with the ones who had a strict view of second repentance, and they didn't believe you could be saved. If you committed apostasy during a Roman persecution, you're done. You can't be saved. Well, you had Christian writers like Tertullian saying, wait a minute, Peter himself denied Christ.
Right.
And then was saved. So how can you say that? So, but here's what I'm going to say this about Constantine. You want a man who was raised in a military home with a father who was, by all accounts, a great general and a great man who was beloved by his troops and the Roman citizens that he was protecting. And that's what Constantine grew up with. And he was groomed to be a Caesar, to be a general, which he was. And he was well loved by his men. And he was well loved by the Roman citizens that he protected. Did the barbarians love him? No. He put them to flight, and he went into battle against them because that was his job, to protect the borders of the Roman Empire. And then you have the man that he's serving under go into this brutal persecution of Christians. And then he has a salvation experience. And he's fighting against some of his fellow Roman emperors who are persecuting Christians. I mean, you want him to lay down his shield and walk away from his training. And in his mind, he thinks, this is why God put his hand on me for such a time as this, to protect the Romans against these wicked men who are killing Christians, and they have no right to do that. And the Christian leaders felt the same way. They thought, God has come to our aid. He has raised up a man who can protect us from these wicked Roman rulers. Now, the view of the early church tends to be idealized. Oh, they were martyrs, and look, being martyred is a very important thing. It's and we should respect that, and I do respect that. But we don't want Christians to be martyred, do we? I mean, do we rejoice that right now we have Muslims, killing Christians over in North Africa and over in the Middle East? Do we rejoice over their martyrdom? I mean, we rejoice that there's maybe that they stand firm in their faith, but we don't want to see people slaughtered, do we?
Right.
I mean,
I understand. I know what you're saying, and I understand that from that perspective. Sure. And I'm saying, unfortunately, I'm running down. I've got the last minute before we're going to have to sign off. And before we go,
do it again.
Al, I love you. I respect you.
I love you too, man.
I love your passion, and you're my brother, and I'm excited. And you know what, man? I appreciate that you. Thank you for. Thank you that we can have these kind of conversations about this kind of stuff, because it's helpful to me. I think it's helpful to people that are listening. And I don't know, if nothing else, I'm very blessed by it. So I thank you. Thank you for your time, Al.
Hey, listen, man, I appreciate you and what you do, and we'll be in touch, okay? I know you got to go. Take care.
All right. God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye. Well, thank you for listening to Subversive Radio. Again, special thanks to my friend and my guest, Dr. Al Baker. We will continue the conversation moving forward about church nonviolence in the church, hierarchy in the church, and things like that coming up. But for now, good night. Thanks for listening, and let the kingdom come. God bless.